Hello and welcome to the first event in our spring speaker series, a lecture and conversation with writer and podcast host Rob Hopkins. I'm David Politzer, director of the School of Art at the University of Houston. And once again, we've assembled an impressive list of speakers for this series that we're very excited to share with you. In addition to today's event, this Thursday, we welcome artist and musician Lisa E. Harris at 6:30 p.m. On April 8th, also at 6:30, we welcome multimedia performance artist Miwa Matrejek. And then later in April, on the 30th, we welcome art historian Jong-Woo Jeremy Kim. And that lecture is also in the afternoon, like today's at 2 p.m. I invite you to check the events page on the School of Art website. There's a visiting speaker menu option, and that's where you can find all the links and connection information for these great talks. And if you haven't already followed us on social media, please do. We post announcements and all the connection information that you need for these talks, plus a lot of other great stuff. The handle is at UH if you don't already follow. Before we begin, some congratulations are in order. Our third year MFA students just opened their thesis exhibition in the Blaffer Art Museum here on the UH campus. And I encourage everyone to go see this excellent show, which is a culmination of their 3 years of hard work here at the School of Art. There's a catalog for the exhibition that'll be available later this week. And FYI, you do need to make an appointment to visit the Blaffer, but there's a very easy online form to fill out on the Blaffer website, and they're open Wednesday through Sunday. It's super easy, just go to the website and make an appointment. Before we begin, just a couple notes about how this is gonna run. These are copied and pasted from last semester's notes for the most part, and it seems very quaint that we had to explain how a Zoom meeting worked. I feel like 3 or 4 months later, everybody knows. So I won't belabor this too much, but I just did want to give everybody a heads up that we're recording the talk, and if that you want to access it later, it'll be available on our YouTube channel. And I encourage you to check out that YouTube channel because it's quickly becoming a rich archive of past visiting speaker engagements, not only from this series, but also from other speaker events that are happening in the various School of Art programs. Next, this is a webinar, not a regular meeting, which means you can see us, but we can't see you, meaning the attendees. That will change slightly when we move to the Q&A. At that point, if you have a question for Rob, go ahead and raise your hand, or you can type it in the chat or the Q&A boxes. John and I will be monitoring those, and we can ask you to unmute your mic and ask your question verbally, or if you prefer, you can just type it in the box and we'll ask it for you. Okay, and I will now turn it over to John Reed, Professor of Interdisciplinary Practices and Emerging Forms, who will introduce Rob.
Hey, welcome everybody. Welcome class, friends, everybody around the world, apparently. It is my absolute delight to introduce Rob Hopkins today, a person that I have followed for well over a decade. Many people know him from his the Transition Handbook, which our class follows, and but he is author also, co-founder of Transition Town Totnes, the Transition Network, author of the Transition Companion, The Power of Just Doing Stuff, 21 Stories of Transition, and his most recent work is the podcast From What Is to What Next, and unleashing the power of imagination to create the future we want. I feel like I've just mushed two things together there, but that is it. Sorry, Rob. And I'm subscribing to that on Patreon and have heard a couple of great episodes. For those of you unfamiliar with his work, Rob is an environmentalist, a researcher, and an activist, and an artist. I am in front of one of his lino cuts, but mostly, I'm not going to say mostly anything, all of the above. But like many environmentalists who are rightly concerned with the climate crisis, he makes a compelling argument that we have no choice. We have to do something. The facts are inescapable and frightening, but thankfully, Rob deals less with the frightening aspects and goes on to ask us to imagine the best world we can imagine. And then let's figure out how to get there. And that I cannot repay him enough for, both for inspiring everybody and also for letting me sleep at night. So I don't want to take any more time away from Rob's presentation other than to thank him and ask you all to send a text or a warm telepathic welcome to Rob Hopkins. Rob, welcome.
Thank you, everybody. Lovely to see you all, and thank you for the very kind words, John and David. And yeah, I did foundation art when I was 18, and I always wanted to go back to art school, and I haven't managed it yet. So maybe this is about as close as I'll get. So it's lovely to be here with you all, and I'm just going to share my screen because I want to share nice things with you. Not that you're not allowed to see that. Oh dear, hang on a second. Why won't that? Sorry, you can see this is a very professional operation here. Go back to that, and talk amongst yourselves, and we'll be ready in a second. All right. Okay. So, yes, I am indeed Rob, and I want to talk to you today about some of the stuff that was in the book that I published recently, What Is to What If, and then the podcast is called From What If to What Next. So the theme that I want to really discuss is I'm not having much luck. Be there in a second. My computer was on. Right. So what would it be like if the next 10 years felt like a revolution of the imagination? This is not going to be entirely just me speaking. There is, at one point, we're going to do an exercise together. We're actually going to make Houston history. We're going to do something that has never been done before in the history of Houston, and you will be able to tell your grandchildren that you were here for this auspicious evening when that thing happened. But before we get onto that, I want to just start with a little bit of what the Extinction Rebellion movement might call tell the truth. Just a little bit of situating us where we are in the flow of history. So I like to think that where we are today is like we're standing on top of a mountain. Those of us in the global north are in effect standing on top of a mountain of carbon, plastic, inequality, debt, anxiety, loneliness. And while it is true that some of us have more incredible, spectacular views than anybody's ever really had in the past, that's absolutely not the case for everybody. And the people who are at our side, who are our guides, who know this mountain really well, are saying to us, are tugging our sleeves and saying, we need to get down off this mountain really, really quickly. You can see the storm clouds that are coming. We absolutely need to get down off here. And for some of us, that's okay. That's enough. We trust them. They're the guides. They know the mountain. For a lot of people, that doesn't seem to be enough. And the thought that I want to kind of sow in your imagination this evening is that encouraging people to do that is not the work of facts and figures and numbers. It's the work of imagination, and it's the work of storytelling. Because how different would it be if, rather than trying to convince people that we need to get down off this mountain, instead what we did was to tell the stories about the lower valleys of this mountain, the lower slopes that await us when we get there. What's the welcome that waits for us? About if we could tell the stories about the food, about the drink, about the warm, soft mattresses, the welcoming firesides, the dry socks that await us when we get down there, then our work doesn't become one of trying to convince people, it becomes one of cultivating longing. If we were able to cultivate longing for a post-carbon world, it would kind of be inevitable that we would get there. After all, when Neil Armstrong went to the moon in 1969, that wasn't his idea. It wasn't JFK's idea when he announced the moon mission in 1960. We had been going to the moon for decades before then, in songs, in comic books. Frank Sinatra sang us to the moon. Mickey Mouse probably went to the moon. I don't know, everybody had gone to the moon in some way or another. And what it did was it built this collective longing to get to the moon that meant that when we decided to do it, it was done in 9 years, and the average age of the team who did it was 26. So how different would our activism be if, rather than trying to convince people that we were right, it was framed instead around the cultivation of longing? And I'm going to be talking about imagination this evening because for me it feels a vitally important part of this conversation. Imagination is an extraordinary thing, and my favorite definition of it is by John Dewey, the educationalist, who described it as the ability to see things as if they could be otherwise. I love that. The ability to see things as if they could be otherwise. If there was ever a superpower that we need to cultivate in 2021, it's the ability, I would argue, to see things as if they could be otherwise. And I take a lot of inspiration from different movements and people around the world who have kept this idea of keeping imagination central to their politics. And this is Walida Imarisha, who co-wrote an amazing book called Octavia's Brood, and who writes sort of speculative fiction. And in Octavia's Brood, she wrote, whenever we try to envision a world without war, without violence, without prisons, without capitalism, we are engaging in speculative fiction. All organizing is science fiction. I think that's just so brilliant. All organizing is science fiction. You'll wake up at 3 a.m. today going, wow, yes. Once the imagination is unshackled, liberation is limitless. And one of the things that I often refer to when I talk about imagination is Green Eggs and Ham, which I'm sure many of you were read to as kids or have read to your own kids. The beautiful thing about Green Eggs and Ham was that when Dr. Seuss wrote it, he wrote it because he was challenged by his publisher to write a book that just included 50 words. That was his palette with which to paint. It took him 2 years, and he said afterwards it was one of his most kind of challenging but enjoyable writing experiences. The beautiful thing about imagination is when you put limits around it, you're able to be so much more imaginative. If I said, John, tell us a story, that's kind of tricky. Like, where do you start? Where am I going to? But whereas if I said, John, tell me a story about the mouse who lives under the piano in your house. He has a little blue hat, and every Thursday he likes to play the piano. Then you've got a framework around it within which to be imaginative. It's why when we study improvisational theatre, you get given these scenarios. Okay, you're a bus driver and you hate going out after dark, and you're whatever, and then you have to act out a role. So the beautiful thing about climate change and communities and responses is that when you frame things in the context of the climate and ecological emergency, and when, as Naomi Klein says, you realize that there are no non-radical solutions left, then we're in a situation where our imaginations can really get to work. And it's what I see again and again in all the different transition groups that I visit around the world. My concern is that we are experiencing an imagination crisis in a time when we need to be at our most imaginative, because we have to reimagine and rebuild our energy system, our food system, our employment system, our economic system in a very short period of time, a shorter period of time than anyone has ever done it before. That actually, and our imagination should be a muscle like this. It's actually like this. And this was research published in 2010. It made the front page of Newsweek. It was a really big deal. People said, by a researcher who looked at this big test for creativity going back to the early 1960s in the US. And her conclusion was that IQ and imagination rose together till the mid-90s. IQ kept rising, and imagination went into what she called a steady and persistent decline, and has been declining ever since. Made the front page of Newsweek. People said, what does this mean for economic growth? And what does this mean for Pixar? but I never heard anyone say, what does this mean for the climate movement, the social justice movement? And it's fundamentally important, because you cannot build what you cannot imagine. And if most people's mental picture of a low carbon future is sitting in a cold cave eating green potatoes, then we have a real problem. And so the imagination then becomes the most important thing that we need to be cultivating in our society. So at this point, I'm going to invite you to do an exercise with me. What we are going to attempt is the first act of collective time travel in the history of Houston. So this is something that's never been done before. I've spent lockdown building a time machine with some plans I found on the internet and some things that I had in the garage, and it's amazing. And what I've done is I've set it to take us to 2030. And the 2030 that it's going to take us to is not utopia, but it is the 2030 that is the result of, between now and then, everything that could possibly have been done being done. That these 10 years were a revolution of the imagination, that things felt possible that in 2021 really didn't feel possible. So I'm going to invite you to make yourself comfortable and to close your eyes. And I'm going to turn on my time machine in a moment. I'm just going to get it warmed up here. There we go. And in a minute, when I turn it on, my invitation is that you're going to hear me turn on my time machine, and then you'll hear the sound of you being picked up from 2021 and dropped down into 2030. As I said, this is not utopia. It's the result of everything that could possibly have been done being done. And it's the result of an extraordinary social, economic, cultural transition. And we'll just take 2 minutes in silence in your imagination to just take a walk around in that world. What do you see? What do you hear? What do you feel? What do you taste as you walk around? And we're just going to sit then in silence for about 2 minutes, so that in your imagination you can take a walk around the Houston of 2030 that is the result of us doing everything we possibly could. So I'm going to turn on my time machine and I will see you in 2 minutes. So I'm going to invite you to return, if I may, to 2021. Welcome back. I hope you had a good journey. And to just invite you for a minute or so to use the chat. If there were 3 words that encapsulated what it was that you observed in the 2030, could we just take a minute or so just for you to put those into the chat, and we'll just see what scrolls past us as you reflect on that. Fresh air, bikes on roads, quiet. Thank you, Sarah. No cars, clean. Peace, safety, community. Local scaled business. Thank you, John. Peacefulness, clear sky, clean Gulf of Mexico. Clean, clear, green. Self-sustaining, says Sydney. Thank you, Sydney, for that. Peacefulness, clear sky. Self-sustaining, music from the Bogeda. I don't know how you say that word. We don't have that word over here. Bogeda. 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 Thank you, Suzette. Just see if there's a couple more. Waste reduction, cleaner Gulf, electrical, public transportation, nature, wonder, sleep. That sounds like my perfect holiday there, William. Thank you. Swimming in the bayou, no flooding, community, green, calm, maker space-ism, food gardens, happy campers. Thank you, Jimena. No flooding. Well, thank you all so much for doing that. So to give a little bit of context, that's an exercise which I do with groups of people of many different sizes. I've done that exercise with 10 people in a room, and I've done it with 1,500 people in a hall in Belgium. And for me, what's really powerful about it is that it allows us to step beyond the immediate and into a different kind of a future. And it feeds into that thing of longing. So when we look at how do we cultivate longing, I think one way we can do that is through visual arts. And this is a guy called James Mackay at the University of Leeds, who is the man who draws the future. And this is his drawing of the city he lives in, Leeds, if it became the most biodiverse city in the world. If in 2021, the longing became sufficiently intense so that by 2030, everything that could have been done over the last 8-9 years to increase the biodiversity was done, what would it look like? Looking at this picture, you can almost imagine what that might sound like and smell like to walk around in that world. This is another of his pictures to say, once we start to get the cars out of our city, which we have to, we know from that COVID has meant that people in the areas with the worst pollution have been the most vulnerable, the most susceptible to COVID, that we need to be getting the cars out of our cities, and we dedicate them so much space in LA. Something like 2/3 of the surface area of LA is dedicated to cars. Well, once you start to take the cars out of a city, you reclaim that space. And then what do you do with it? Well, maybe we turn our cities into places like this so that our kids walk to school through streets with food being grown, and that's part of the urban fabric. How different would that be? We could do that in a few years if the longing was sufficiently strong to enable us to do that. And one of the problems that we have is that when we walk around in Houston in 2021, we look at the streets that we've known and we assume that they're always going to be like that. There's nothing there to suggest that they could be any different. We live in a world that leads us to believe that change can only happen in little incremental steps, even though all the evidence is that the time is far too late for little incremental steps. This is a beautiful little animation produced by a project in London called London National Park City. This is Fleet Street. Some of you may have visited it in London. Every time you walk down the street, you assume it's always going to look like that. Well, if you do this to it, it really helps. All of a sudden, the possibilities of Fleet Street start to change. We can see its possibilities in very, very different ways by taking that space back and giving it back to people, to conviviality, to community, and to nature. And you might be thinking at this point, well, Rob, that's all very nice, but actually in the real world, that kind of thing doesn't happen. Well, in Barcelona, recently, the municipality in Barcelona announced that they were going to close 1/3 of all of the streets in the center of the city. And they were going to turn those streets into forests, places for people to meet, to hang out. This kind of thing is happening in more and more cities around the world now, where we take back the space from the cars. And when we do that, we realized how much cars have taken away from us. And I'll come back to that a little bit later in this talk. So I want to share two little films which have started playing without me asking them to. Two little films that I've made. So John very kindly mentioned at the beginning the podcast that I do, From What If to What Next. And in every episode in that podcast is framed around a what if question. So what if birdsong drowned out the traffic? What if we had a universal basic income? What if we decolonized our education system? And in each of those, I ask my two guests at the beginning to do the exercise you did at the beginning of this. We traveled to 2030, and I asked them to just take me for a walk in the context of that what if question. So walk us round a city which has had a universal basic income for 8 years. Rather than debate whether it's a good idea or not, we go forward and we experience that. And from the first 9 episodes, I cut out my very favorite little bits of people's vision. And over the last couple of months, I've worked with 2 amazing animators who've made these 2 little 1-minute long films. So I'm just going to show you these because I rather love them.
We're going to be using re in our language. We're going to be rebuilding, refurbishing, remaking, reusing, recreating, reinventing. The re is going to be a big part of our language.
Police and prisons and the armed forces were massively defunded, and that money has gone into robust preventative health care and well-being programs that also contribute to a rich imagination.
Financial insecurity has been eradicated. People no longer go to work because they have no choice.
And so all these workspaces that used to be occupied by big banks are now, of course, being redirected and used for creative spaces of all sorts, whether it's technical or artistry.
If you see girlfriends meet each other, they won't say, oh, you got this new dress, but they will say, oh, you got the same dress that you wore last week, but now you've made a little change about it. And that's so fancy and that's so fashionable.
The city really changed since the Ministry of Imagination was born. The city has become a huge laboratory in which everyone can participate.
You can hear laughter, not just the laughter of children, but the laughter of adults.
The place is alive with activity. There's people everywhere doing things.
People can walk freely in their bodies, regardless of their shape, their size, their abilities, their gender expressions, the color of their skin, their age, and there's an embrace of that.
We care about the things that we have. We cherish them, we repair them, we make sure that they will last for a very long time.
Faces are beautifully lined, full of the marks of laughter and a life well lived. It smells like growing things.
Yeah, so thank you for that, and I hope you enjoyed those. And there's one more to come. But for me, the brief to the animators was to cultivate longing, and which hopefully. So, what I want to share with you this evening is 9 what-if questions, which are the chapters out of the book From What Is to What If, and which hopefully will go deeper into these arguments about why I think imagination is so important. So I mentioned at the beginning that research that was on the front page of Newsweek magazine, and in it she speculated about why it might be that we were seeing that decline in imagination. And she put it down to a few different things, one of which was the decline of play in our everyday life. So when I was a kid, without wishing to get too sort of nostalgic about it, because it wasn't all great at all, but there was an incredible culture of children playing outdoors. And I love this picture of this little girl who's gone out in her dad's shoes, and I have pictures of him getting up to go to work in the morning and finding his shoes have disappeared. The children had a whole culture of games and places and activities and songs that adults knew nothing about at all. And this was how children learned to take risks. It was how children learned to manage conflict. It was how they learned to cooperate. And this kind of let's pretend free play is absolutely fundamental to the mental health of kids and to their emotional well-being, and it has disappeared almost entirely. Our children have been driven indoors by cars, by stranger danger, by a whole range of different things, and we see a massive rise in mental ill health among young people. And so I was really keen to try and find a place where they were bringing that back again. And I visited a street in a city called Bristol, near where I live, where a project called Playing Out closes the streets, makes it really easy for communities to close their streets to play. And I went to this street on a Wednesday night. It was full of children playing, drawing with chalk all over the pavements. It was just fantastic. I spoke to one of the mums who said, this is just what happens when you get the cars out of the way. And I spoke to one of the dads who said, well, after doing this for about 6 months, we all realized that we actually quite liked each other. You know, you started to see how children playing out was one of the key reasons that there was a social fabric between all the adults. It gave them something to talk about. So the loss of play from our culture has been hugely harmful, I think. In my town a few years ago, we did a thing called a street games festival. We closed the square at the top of the town, and it was filled up with kids playing, and it was just fantastic. And for the first half, the parents stood around saying, isn't this great seeing our children playing in the street? And the second half, they got involved too, and then it was just complete chaos. This is one of my favorite games that was played that day. It's a Dutch game called Speakerpoopin, where you hang a nail or a screw on a piece of string, you tie it to the back of your trousers or your skirt, and then looking backwards between your knees, you have to get it into the neck of the bottle. And if any of you have children or grandchildren and you're worried about their attention spans, this game is amazing. This girl was doing this for about 10 minutes, trying to get this nail into the neck of this bottle. So bringing play back into our streets and into our culture wherever we can is so important, as well as bringing it back into our activism. And as adults, we need to play too. And when we lose that ability to be silly and to play and to ask what if, we lose a huge amount too. This is an activity that was developed in the transition movement, working with an organization called Encounters Arts, called Transition Town Anywhere, or Pop Up Tomorrow, sometimes it's called. You need a big space, you need between 100 and 400 people, and you do the exercise we did at the beginning. You imagine you stepping into 2030, you walk around in it, what's it like? Then you think, okay, what am I doing in this future? What's my role? And then you find other people who share the thing you're interested in. And then together you build that world literally with cardboard and bamboo and sticky tape and string. You have a bank and you have food shops and you have an energy company, and you build it all out of cardboard, and then you live in it and trade it and inhabit it for some time. And to be among 300 adults completely lost in a play world of their imagining is one of the most magical things I've ever been involved with, as is meeting all the different people afterwards who then went on to create the thing that they played. This was the last time we did it. This might look to you like some chairs, some cardboard boxes, a few sticks. These two young men here have built the public transport system for Transition Town Anywhere, and they can tell you everything about this, what color the tickets are, where it goes, what noise it makes. For them, this is a fully imagined thing. And the poet Rilke once said, the future must enter into you a long time before it happens, which I love. This is an exercise that does that. It allows us to inhabit and test drive a different future. First time I did this in 2012, I ended up with a group of people where we imagined that we were running a brewery and a mill and a bakery in the same building. And we even down to the naming our beers and how our training program worked, our community investment program. Next year in my town, we started a brewery. Last year, we turned it into a community brewery in order to raise the money. And by the end of this year, it will be in the same building as a bakery and a mill. And I know it's going to work because I played it. I absolutely know that it's going to work. So my second question, what if we considered a healthy imagination vital to our health? Normally we think of imagination as something that's a bit kind of frivolous, a bit of a luxury, something kids do. I would argue that it's absolutely vital to our well-being. This is a really important part of your brain called the hippocampus. It is the part of the brain where your memory and your imagination fire from. In many ways, when you're being imaginative, what you're doing is going to the cupboards of your memory and looking through them and finding things. And when you get two things and put them together and make something that didn't exist before, that's the imagining piece. So we can only really be as imaginative as we have interesting things in the memory in our memory cupboards, as it were. And so when you're trying to imagine a low carbon future, it really matters that you fill those cupboards with stories from around the world of what that would actually look like and experiences that you've had. The thing that I find most fascinating about the hippocampus is that it is the part of your brain that is most vulnerable to cortisol. So when we are anxious, traumatized, in stress, it can shrink. And when it shrinks, we lose that ability to see the future in positive, hopeful ways, and we get stuck in the present or stuck in the past. And it feels to me like we are creating this kind of perfect storm of conditions that are ruinous to the human imagination, because we know that anxiety, trauma, and so on are damaging. I think we need to also recognize that imagination to a degree is a function of privilege. If your basic needs on Maslow's hierarchy of needs aren't met, if you don't know where you're going to be sleeping next week, you don't know where your next meal is coming from, if you experience systemic racism and economic exclusion, it's very hard to have a really kind of vibrant imagination. So I was really interested to try and find somewhere that was intentionally setting out to rebuild the hippocampus, a kind of a campus for the hippocampus, if you like. And if the University of Houston wants to use that in their next rebranding, you're very welcome. So I went to Dundee in Scotland to visit an amazing project called Art Angel, run by Rosalie Somerton here. What Art Angel do is they work with people with burnout, mental health problems, people who've gone through the mental health services and out the other side. And they say, when you come here, you're not a patient or a client, you're an artist preparing work for an exhibition. And every year in the biggest exhibition gallery in Dundee, they exhibit their work. And I spoke to lots of people who knew I was coming and were really happy to tell me their stories. It was very moving. I spoke to one woman who said, I have 2 beautiful small children, a partner who I adore. Last 6 months ago, I came that close to taking my own life. If it hadn't have been for coming here. And now I can see the future again. It was many people told me I can see the future again. And when I asked Rosalie, how do you do this? She said, what we do is we create a space of safety and hope. And when I was there, she told me about how every year, to evaluate how well they're doing, they ask all of their artists to fill out a piece of paper. And it's not a multiple choice survey or something. It's a piece of paper with 2 outlines of a human body. They say, fill the first one to show how you felt before you came here, and the second one to show how you feel now you've been coming to Art Angel for a while. I looked at a big pile of them like this. It was very, very moving. You really could see how powerful the work they do is. And I just want to share one with you, which kind of speaks for itself. So when I look at that, firstly, I really see how powerful the work they do is, and how powerful it is to hold people in the way that they do. But secondly, when I look at this, I think this is what it will feel like if the next 10 years does everything that the science tells us we need to. If we get to 2030, 2035, we've decarbonized our societies, and we have gone through a time that was this phenomenal revolution of the imagination, what would it feel like to arrive at that point? This is kind of has become the image that gets me out of bed in the morning. You know, the idea that somehow a low carbon future is about less of things. I think really we need to reframe that narrative to say that it's actually about a lot more things. And to live in a society coming into contact with its own imagination will feel quite extraordinary. The third one, what if we followed nature's lead? What I mean by this is that most of the great Imagineers in our culture, in our society, took their inspiration from nature, from Shakespeare to Matisse to I don't know, Nina Simone, you know, derived some of that inspiration from time in nature. Albert Einstein always said his best ideas came to him when he rode his bicycle through the forest. But we're living in a time where the diversity of the natural world around us is contracting. During my lifetime, I'm 52, or since the Beatles split up, however you want to look at it, we have lost 70% of the creatures we share this planet with, or exterminated, maybe is probably a more accurate term. I think that when the diversity of the natural world around us contracts, our imagination contracts with it. The microbiologist René Dubos used to say, if we lived on the moon, our imagination would be as barren as the moon. So when the world around us, when we know that we're living through the time of the climate and ecological emergency with this impoverishment of the diversity of the world around us, I think that has a really harmful impact on our imagination. I loved hearing the story when I was researching the book about how in Shetland, in Scotland, when people visit the doctor suffering from depression or anxiety or obesity, the doctor prescribes them nature connection and gives them activities to do every month. So you might go and see the doctor in May and he'll prescribe you to bury your face in the grass, make a daisy chain, plant a tree, turn over a rock and see what's underneath it. We have become so distanced from nature. We spend less and less time in the natural world, and reconnecting people to it, I think, is fundamentally important to the revival of our collective imagination. In London lives a geographer. He calls himself a guerrilla geographer called Daniel Raven Ellison. He took his son to visit all the national parks around London. And then when he came back to London, he created this map of the city, which just shows the green spaces and the blue spaces. This is London with no streets, no car parks, no buildings, nothing like that. Just the green space, just the blue space, including people's gardens, whatever. When he did that, he realized that 49.5% of London was green space and blue space. So he thought, well, if we could just make another 0.5%, the majority of London would be green space and blue space. That's just 1 square meter for every person. So then London could be qualified as a national park. So they ran this project called London National Park City. Last year, the Mayor of London declared London a national park city, and it's a beautifully invitational process that invites people to see the city in a different way. And they use what-if questions a lot, which I'll talk about more shortly. But they would say things like, what if the rivers in London were so clean you could swim to work? What if the bird song drowned out the traffic? What if there were more trees than people in London? And this way of reconnecting people in the city to nature is really inspiring, I think. What if we fought back for our attention? So I'd like to invite you to imagine that you are in France, in the city of Arles, in the south of France, in the Provence, in 1888, in a place called Place Lamartine, in a small little yellow house, and into the kitchen comes Vincent van Gogh. I would say Van Gogh, but I'm speaking to an American audience, so I'll say Vincent van Gogh, comes into his kitchen carrying a big bunch of sunflowers, beautiful sunflowers. He was just given them by someone called Patience Ascelier, whose portrait he painted the week before. He comes into the kitchen, he arranges them on his little table in a beautiful kind of very simple but nice earthenware pot, sits back on his little rickety chair, lights his pipe, looks at the sunflowers as the sunlight streams in through his window, gets out his smartphone, thinks, I'm just going to check my Instagram page. And I'll check my Twitter and my Facebook and my Pinterest account and my email. And 2 hours later, he's watching videos of skateboarders falling downstairs. And he can't remember why he even started watching videos of skateboarders falling downstairs. If that had happened, we wouldn't have this. And we wouldn't have had all of the phenomenal impact this extraordinary, and the other ones that he did as well, his Sunflowers series, have had on people. When I'm in London, I go to the National Gallery, I sit in front of this picture for half an hour. It fills me with light that sustains me for about the next 6 months. Art, in many ways, is basically distilled attention. As a culture, when our attention span declines and declines and declines, we will see less and less extraordinary things like this, which is his brilliant, ecstatic, focused attention. But we're living in a time where our collective attention span is getting less and less and less. As one guy, Sven Birkitz, I interviewed for the book, said, we are losing the very paradigm of depth. As a culture, when our ability with knowledge was such that our attention spans were powerful enough that we could dive deep into that body of knowledge, that's where wisdom comes from in a culture. Increasingly, we just water ski across the top and we become more and more impoverished as a result. We have these highly addictive devices in our pockets that we are evolutionarily unequipped to deal with, and we have become completely averse to being bored. But boredom is when your imagination is calling you. Boredom is really, really precious time. And we just fill that with trying to get to the bottom of our Facebook feed, or the chief executive of Netflix recently said their main competition as a business is sleep. So we have to reimagine our relationship with these things, and reconnecting with our attention span, creating the conditions for that is vital for our imagination. What if school nurtured young imaginations? We have an education system, I would argue, that is profoundly damaging to the imagination, and researching the chapter about the state of health of imagination in our education system in 2021 was heartbreaking, I have to say. One of the things that all of the schools I talked to around the world who were doing different things around imagination talked about was a school in Italy, in a place called Reggio Emilia. And in Reggio Emilia in 1945, the Germans were retreating north. They left behind them 1 tank, 6 horses, and 3 trucks. And they sold them to build a school. And that school was built based on the philosophy of how do you create an education system to ensure that fascism never happens again. What a fantastic framing for an education system. How do they do it? Well, they don't learn by subjects, they learn by projects. At the heart of every school is a workshop, an atelier, where someone will help you make whatever you want to make. The building is full of plants and light. They think about kids as being authors of their own learning. It's an extraordinary model. And it struck me when I was researching it that actually what we have done in the US, in the UK, across Europe, is to institutionalize a model of education which is almost exactly its opposite. And then we wonder why it is that we're seeing a resurgence of these kind of ideas that we hoped had been consigned to history. And I looked at many different places who were doing interesting things. One of them, it turned out, was just up the road from me in a city called Plymouth, a pretty poor city on the south coast of England, where they have an amazing art school. And the guy who ran the art school noticed that he was having more and more conversations with 16, 17-year-olds who after they'd been there a few weeks would say, "Oh, we love it here." And he'd say, "Why? Why do you love it so much?" And they'd say, "Because we've spent the last 12 years trying to pass tests, trying to guess the right answer in our teacher's head. We haven't done anything creative for 12 years. I mean, how heartbreaking is that for a start?" So he got this idea of saying, well, what would it look like if we designed a school that ran from the ages of 4 to 16 that was designed like an art school? Art school doesn't teach you what to think, it teaches you how to think. Art school is something which is a completely different context, as you all know better than I do. So originally they wanted to do it in an old department store in the center of Plymouth. That didn't work. So their brief to the architects when they were offered this site in the city was, design us a department store that we could occupy as a school. It should have no classrooms that resemble a cell for 30 inmates. It should have performance space, music space. In the end, the design, they call it the Red House, not the Yellow House like Vincent House, but the Red House. Downstairs, when you first come in there, atelier is a food atelier. You can learn how to cook, how to prepare food. And this is what their classrooms look like. No rows of desks. It's like an art school. And I'm not, it may not be that we can turn all schools like this, but we have to profoundly reimagine our education system so that its primary goal is to produce young people who are as imaginative as they could possibly be. What if our storytelling was able to bring a positive future to life? What if after tonight, the vision that you had of 2030, you were able to drop into every conversation you had with friends and colleagues about the future and about climate change? This is James Mackay, who did those drawings I showed you at the beginning. He sometimes goes out into his city, he sets up his easel, he starts to draw what's in front of him. As people walk past, he'll stop them and say, "Excuse me, how do you think this city could be in the future?" And then he adds their ideas into his picture. He said, all you need is a really simple sketch and people's ideas just start to flow out. This is 2 researchers from the university in Plymouth, Jackie Andrade and John May. They came up with something called functional imagery training, which is fascinating. What it does is it works with people who want to make a change in their lives by getting them to become their own inner storytellers of how that can be. They work with people to really imagine, say if someone's overweight, they really want to lose weight. They work with them to imagine in a really multi-sensory way what a day in the life would be like, to tell themselves the stories of what it would be like in a way that they can almost smell it and touch it and feel it. What would it be like to be out running and feeling the sunlight on your skin or whatever? And they find an incredible success rate in people who make a change and then sustain that change. And it makes me feel like, well, what would it be like to do the same in relation to climate change? They call it making memories of the future. I love that term. And this is a guy called Per Gronqvist, who works for the Swedish government. His job title is Chief Storyteller. He's the chief storyteller for the Swedish government, and his job description is to bring to life the day-to-day realities of living in a low-carbon future. Every municipality, every government should have a chief storyteller. Every university, every course, we should all have the capacity to be the chief storyteller and to bring a different future to life. What if we started asking better questions? By which I mean, what if we became really good at asking what-if questions? A good what-if question kind of gives us an insight. It gives us a taste of a different way that the future could be. And I just want to share a couple of my favorites with you that are in the book. This is in London, South London, in Tooting, a very built up area of London. There's nowhere in Tooting that's like a village green or a town square. There's a place it could be, which is here, which is normally a bus turning circle full of buses. The air quality is terrible. It just doesn't work. So the transition group in Tooting did an event they called the Tooting Twirl, where they took over that space and they turned it into what it would be like if it already was our village green. They put real grass down on the ground. They filled it with conversation and coffee, music, and carnival. And for a day, people got to experience as if that was their village green. I got to sit with my shoes and socks off and feel the green grass of Tooting beneath my feet. And during that day, something amazing happened. At the beginning of the day, people said, if this was our village green, by about midday, they started to say, when this is our village green. And I even heard people looking at this wall, which if there was a competition for London's dullest wall, this would make the top 3, I would think, having conversations about when this is our village green, what story about ourselves are we going to paint on that wall? Somewhere deep underneath, the tectonic plates of permission started to shift. It was really quite an extraordinary thing to see. This is another one from Liège in Belgium, where I went 7 years ago, and the transition group there, Liège en Transition, came up with a what-if question. They said, what if in a generation's time, the majority of food eaten in this city came from the land closest to this city? What a great question. Because it gives you a taste of, it gets you thinking, yeah, what if that was the case? I went to a big event where they invited all the people in the city who cared about food. Then they came home. I didn't hear much for 4 or 5 years. A couple of years ago, I went back. And in that time, they've created 25 new cooperatives in Liège. They raised 5 million euros of investment, not from the bank, from local people investing in those cooperatives. They started a farm, 2 vineyards, a brewery. They started a shop in the center of the city called the Small Producers, which after 6 months of doing so well, they opened a second. They now have 4. I met the mayor of the city who said to me, we used to say we wanted to be a smart city. Now we want to be a transition city. We didn't start this, but our role is to support it and remove all the blockages to it happening. It was extraordinary, really moving for me as somebody who, since I wrote the Transition Handbook, which John mentioned at the beginning, have had this vision of how the future could be. In Liège, there it is. I'm walking around in it. I'm seeing people employed by it. I'm having my lunch in it. I'm using the local currency that stitches the whole thing together. This stuff is possible, but it started with ordinary people with a really great what-if question. And I've loved seeing since the book came out and during this year of COVID, the number of communities who have used what-if as the framing for where do we go next. This is a transition group in Cornwall who every day for a month posted a different beautiful what-if graphic online. I love this. What if car parks became play parks? What if cyclists were given priority on roads? And this was one of my favorite ones. What if there was a daily imagination lesson? And by the end, after doing this for 30 days, this was the last one they put up. They didn't need any more to put the whole words. People had got the idea. But actually the image speaks to contentment and conviviality and community. I think one of the reasons that exercise you did at the beginning, and I have done that exercise now hundreds of times with different groups, is that it takes us beyond what capitalism does, and sort of consumer culture. It is always dropping desires in front of us, and it obscures the future because our short-term desires, which can be sold to us, are always put in front. That exercise lifts us up and beyond that. So what would a future be like that actually gave us happiness and contentment? And this picture really, really speaks to that in a way that I found very moving. In Sweden, the Green Party ran an advertising campaign where they just put the words "what if" over things that already happen. I love this one. What if we lived in a future where father could take his kids to the woods for the day without feeling guilty that he's missing his emails and somehow not being busy enough? What if our city's landscape started to look more like this? There's something very powerful for me about it. And in London recently, in Camden, the city council was the first municipality to declare a climate emergency and the first one to do a citizens' assembly on climate change. And after it, they came together with the local transition group, the local Extinction Rebellion group, local Friends of the Earth group, to create what they called Think and Do, which was a high street imagination space. It was a what if space. And every day for about 2 months, different groups were coming in, sharing their what ifs. It was really beautiful. And after it had finished, they produced this newspaper of people's stories from the future. They created a 100-page newspaper with all of these, and they called it the Camden Future Journal. And on the 1 week, they did the wraparound around the outside of their paper, which is called the Camden New Journal, which was just stories from the future. A beautiful piece of sort of collective what if. My penultimate what if question, which is a very difficult one, I have to say, in the UK in 2021, is what if our leaders prioritize the cultivation of imagination? And by that, what I mean is, if we recognize that we're living in a time of imaginative poverty, where we have perfected the conditions that are ruinous to the human imagination, economic austerity, all of these different things that are happening at the moment, what if we elected people who said our priority is to rebuild our shared imagination? Most governments are elected and they say, we're going to focus on innovation. Now, innovation and imagination are different, and it's really important to tease those apart. Innovation is something you do when your fundamental model works. So pizza, for example, is that you can innovate with pizza. Because we all understand pizza. Pizza's great. Everyone loves pizza. So you can innovate with different flours, different toppings, different cheese or whatever. You don't need to reimagine pizza. That would be ridiculous. Who would want to reimagine pizza? But neoliberal growth-based economics is not like pizza. Neoliberal growth-based economics is driving us off a cliff at great pace. And in that case, innovation is like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. We need to build that imagination muscle so that we can reimagine things. So how do we do that? Firstly, I think we need to be looking at reimagining democracy. This is in Barcelona, where the municipality in Barcelona has set up neighborhood assemblies all across the city, which inform their policy making. So democracy starts in every neighborhood, as a result of which Barcelona is now one of the most imaginative, progressive cities in the world. We need to create an economic model in our cities which invites the imagination to flourish. This is in the city of Preston in the north of England, where they're now very famous for creating what they call the Preston model, an economic model, which says that the prime purpose is to get money to circulate as many times as possible within the local economy. So using the hospitals, the schools, the universities as what they call anchor institutions to spend their money to drive a different kind of economy, which opens up so many more possibilities. This is in Mexico City. The woman holding the microphone is Gabriela Gomez Mont, who, working with the mayor of Mexico City, created what was conceived of as a Ministry of Imagination, whose role was to look after the well-being of the imagination of that city. We should have ministries of imagination all over the place. And this is a story that I heard just before the end of researching the book. This is in Bologna, in the north of Italy, where the municipality noticed a real decline in engagement in democracy in that city. So they created what they called a civic imagination office, not a civic engagement office, not a civic participation office, a civic imagination office. They set up 6 laboratories around the city. And into those laboratories, they invited the community around to come and do open space, visioning exercises, future dreaming things. The brilliant piece was that when those events would come up with good ideas, the municipality would say, that's a great idea. Okay, let's make that happen. We can offer this, this, and this. What can you offer? You can offer that and that. Good. Okay, let's make a pact. And in the last 5 years in Bologna, they've made 500 pacts between the municipality and the population, ranging from small things like gardens on streets to big things like turning old office blocks into a school to teach classical music, to train young people as classical musicians. It's now how they do their participatory budgeting. What I love about it is that in a time when our imagination is so sidelined, belittled, ignored, humiliated, and we need to scale that up, it offers a beautiful example of saying every organization who is responsible for looking after people who they serve should invite their imagination and then meet them in the middle. And that's how we start to draw imagination upwards through the system. So my last question, and then we'll get to your questions, which I'm sure will be far more interesting, is what if all of this came to pass? What would it be like to live in a time when anything felt possible? So there aren't very many examples of that through history. And so I did a lot of looking around, and one of my favorite examples of it comes from the student revolutions in Paris in 1968. Often those kind of spaces arise as resistance spaces. And I read some really great oral histories of people who were there, which kind of captured how, to me, it would feel. So one person said, a calm but massive refusal was being expressed. It was fantastic. May was like that, like living on a constant high. Life was beautiful. The weather was lovely. Everything we did immediately belonged to history. All the hierarchies had suddenly dissolved. It really was another world, a dream world perhaps, but it's what I'll always remember, the need and the right for everyone to speak. So this is the last thing I wanted to leave you with, which we call the Imagination Sundial. I'll put a link into this. You don't need to be squinting at all the little writing around the edge. In terms of, if we recognize that we're living in a time of imaginative poverty, what some people call the disimagination machine, how might we reverse that? I think we need to do 4 things. The imagination needs space. We need to design space into our organizations, into our courses, into our movements. We have to give imagination space. Second is place. We need places that you visit which provide gathering places that provide platforms for collective imagining. Places you visit, and then after you leave, when you go home again, you don't look at it and its possibilities in the same way. Art colleges, of course, are great places for catalyzing that. We need practices, and I've spoken about a few during the session. We did one at the beginning, which allow us to connect and to change our frame of possibility. And then lastly, we need pacts. So my last thing I wanted to say was, for me, that's where the transition movement comes in. The transition movement is something we started in 2005, 2006, and I would point you to transitionus.org to find out more about the transition movement in the US. It's something which says, what do we do where we are now? Creating a what-if space and giving it physical form so people can not only imagine 2030, they can go and see it, interact with it, invest in it, buy food from it, buy energy from it. And so where the transition groups are doing small things like planting trees, creating gardens, medium-sized things like starting co-housing projects or community renewable energy companies, or really big things like they're doing in Liège, why they all matter is they give people a taste now in 2021 of how that future could be. I went to one transition project. I said, why do you do this? They said, because we want our children to grow up thinking that this is normal. And that's absolutely what we need to be doing now. So I'm going to wrap up there just to say, if you want to find out anything else about what I do, robhopkins.net is where you can find, if you've read the book and you've enjoyed it, and all of the interviews I did to create that book are on that website. So if there are people you want to find out more about, and the people I've spoken about here, you can find that there. If you want to find out about the transition movement, actually transitionus.org is probably your best place to look. And as John said at the beginning, the podcast that I do, From What If to What Next, is published every couple of weeks. We explore a different what if question. Do come and join me on that. It's a beautiful continuation of the book, and we've had some incredible explorations on there. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And thank you so much for your attention. And I really look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Rob. Anybody who wants to text clapping hands can do so, and I'll clap for you. No, but sorry, nobody's clapping. I'll clap. Rob, I was wondering if I might start off with a question, and oh, there Thank you, Sydney. There we go. A little clapping from Sydney too. All right. I just wanted to start with a question, and other people can get warmed up then. It always takes a little while to sort of start thinking about it. I was wondering if there was anything that you've seen during the pandemic, and we've seen a lot of stuff this year, that sort of was a lesson, or you saw as some sort of way that it could be used as a lesson or a thought exercise for becoming more resilient or moving toward the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Loads, actually. You know, I think the first thing was that it didn't happen everywhere, but it certainly happened some places, that we were able to see what it looks like when a government sits down with scientists, and the scientists say this is an emergency, and the government go, oh, right, you are then, okay. We better act as if this was an emergency, and don't worry about the money. We'll sort the money out, and we'll change what needs to be changed. You know, climate activists have been arguing for years that we have to do that around climate change, and told that that was just completely naive, fanciful thinking to imagine that that would ever happen. Actually, with COVID, it happened in many places. What we've seen as well is this idea that things can only happen in small incremental steps has been revealed as the complete nonsense that it always was. We have seen whole industries completely repurpose themselves in a very short period of time. We've seen distilleries and breweries go from making what they normally make to making hand sanitizer. We've seen companies shift their production over to making PPE. You know, we know that is the case. COVID has basically given us an MRI scan of our communities and our economies, and really revealed the inequality in a very stark way. We know that in the UK, people of colour are 4 times more likely to die from COVID. We know that people who live in poor housing and exposed to high levels of air pollution are more susceptible to it. We've also seen that it's been communities coming together that has been one of the main things that has supported and sustained people through this. As you said at the beginning, I gave up flying in 2006. The idea, and I work with Transition Network, we have a team all over the place, and we don't fly. And we've created a movement in 50 countries without flying all over the world, setting up headquarters in different places. You know, until recently, the idea that you could run a university without having to fly academics all around the world to deliver their latest paper at the conference in Tel Aviv and Tokyo and Rio de Janeiro would have been completely nonsense. But we now know we can absolutely do that. We know we can run a business without having to fly all of our team to Paris for a breakfast meeting once a month. Things have profoundly changed. When I was a kid in the 80s, there was this thing where in cities with vibrant city centers, they were taken over and turned into business districts full of just purely kind of business monocultures and people selling them sandwiches. We now know that we don't really need that space, because so many things can be done from home. So I think be a profound shift, and I think when we come to tell the story about how we turned the climate emergency around, this year and a bit of COVID will be a key part of that story, where our sense of what's possible really profoundly changed.
I saw another question pop up. Is Rajan going to ask that?
Yeah, Rajan, go ahead and unmute and ask the question.
Hi. It's been really interesting and very inspiring. Thank you, Rob, and everyone else. You're from Bristol, so you're very familiar with what's happening in terms of political repression in Britain. I want to ask, in that context, how are we to make the best creative progress? How are we to function, to relate, and make the impact we urgently need to be making? Given that we're going to have immense social disturbance and immense social stress because of the way that our authorities are putting pressure on the people.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really important question. Thank you for that. Well, I would take initially I would take a step back from that and say that I feel like one of the reasons that we're in this mess is because we no longer have I have a dream politicians. You know, we no longer have people who talk about the kind of Bobby Kennedys and the Martin Luther Kings and the people who would fill that space of the future with ideas and dreams and create that kind of longing for the future. We've developed these very dull politicians who just talk in terms of little incremental steps, and we don't have I have a dream politicians anymore, or even really I have a dream movements. And I think that when that happens, what we've seen in the last sort of 5-10 years is people stepping into that space who want us to go backwards, make America great again, take back control, stuff that's like the future is too scary and unknown, so we're going to go backwards. And these kind of nostalgic narratives have been profoundly dangerous, I think. And they've come around partly because we have failed progressive movements have really failed to be kind of I have a dream movements. We kind of got stuck in trying to prove how right we were and arguing over small things, and actually we've lost that ability. So this sort of things that's happening in Bristol at the moment has emerged out of that. Brexit was absolutely the result of that. This idea that people couldn't imagine, it was a lot of the narrative was all about going back to the 50s and taking back control and things being like they used to be, which has been profoundly toxic. And I've seen over the last year or so a lot of movements, and my wife's very, very involved in Extinction Rebellion, where there is a big question about should we be focusing on, so a movement like Extinction Rebellion, which is all about extinction and about saying the whole narrative is about the end of the world and we have to avoid that. But should they come out and say and start talking more explicitly about the future? And there's a real blockage to that. And I take a huge amount of inspiration actually from movements in the US, particularly Black political movements like the prison abolition movement and Mariame Kaba's phenomenal book that came out recently about prison abolition, which is one of the best books I've read for years, which is absolutely a what-if movement, absolutely an imagination movement to keep that question alive of what if there was no prisons for 50, 60, 70 years is just phenomenal. And what it opens up then in terms of the thinking around, okay, so what would justice look like? What would policing look like? Is really, really interesting. And what's happening in Bristol at the moment and all over the UK is an absolutely necessary standing up to profoundly unimaginative politics. And my hope is what I try and do in the work I do is to try and get those movements to create more and more spaces to say, okay, well, so what comes next? What if? Okay, so what if we didn't have this criminal justice law and we had a different way of doing policing? What if we don't talk about what that would look like, then we just get stuck with carrying on with business as usual.
Thanks. Great answer.
We have I'm going to read this other question because I'm not so good with the technical part of getting people to answer live. Jen Barker says, there she is.
Yeah, we can invite her to talk.
Okay.
Hi. Yeah. Thank you for taking my question or multiple questions. I often feel frustrated because I've been very used to critical thinking and thinking outside the box for quite some time. And I often try to ask certain questions and I forget that a lot of other people don't think these ways. Like I've asked a question to, like on Facebook, I've posed the question of like, what if we were to rewrite the Constitution? Like, what would you keep? What would you change? What would you remove entirely? Because it is an old document. It's not this hallowed Bible that a lot of people think of it or talk about it as. And I just have so many ideas that I hope I can see someday, because, while I align more with some of the views of the Liberal Democratic Party, I think it's bored and tired that the two parties are just going back and forth with the same old tired solutions, and we're not the same world as 20 years ago. We need new solutions. We can't keep fighting at each other about the same old binary ideas. We have to come up with new solutions. There are other ways to approach things, and so I'm excited about this project where you're recreating imagination and inspiring. I think it's far more interesting to talk about new solutions than it is to just argue all day about the back and forth.
Thank you. Yeah, it's I feel like it's something that is really quite difficult for a lot of people who are in a very political culture. The idea that there's something about progressive movements where we often don't allow ourselves to believe that we might actually succeed. You know, I meet a lot of people who are climate activists, but when you get them in the pub and have a couple of drinks, they'll say, well, we haven't got a chance, you know, it's too late and we can't do anything. And I feel like all too often we get involved in campaigns just because that's what we do, but we know we're never going to win it. And so I remember I'm a big admirer of Joanna Macy, who I think does extraordinary work around a lot of this and how climate movements work with and kind of transform the grief and the sense of loss that inevitably goes with this work. But I saw her recently. She does an amazing exercise where you get into a pair with somebody else and you sit opposite them and you say, okay, when I think about the collapse of the biosphere, I feel, and you kind of share with each other. You know, she did this exercise. When I think about the collapse of civilization, I feel. But I remember thinking, well, where's the one where you say, when I think about being part of the most extraordinary joined up movement in history that in 10 years saved the biosphere and brought about massive shift in social justice, I feel. You know, where's the bit where we allow the space that might yet still be possible? Because if we close the door to it, then it's never going to happen. Michael Mann talks about inactivists, and he talks about how, you know, people in the climate movement, people in the kind of oil and gas industry, climate skeptics, are inactivists because they no longer try and really deny that climate change is happening. They just say, well, we need to slow it down a bit. But we see the same inactivism in the progressive movements as well. Oh, it's too late, there's no point, you know. So for me, it's really important that we are able to support each other to create sort of cultures where we think it is possible. Of course it's possible.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jen.
Violette.
Your mic's muted, Violette.
Hi. I'm sorry I make that noise. I don't have any question, but it's good to say hello. And I have been reading a lot of your text, and I really enjoy this conversation. I wish I could have something ready, because there's so many questions about that I have about the Canal de Suez, and then. But I'm sorry, I don't have any questions right now ready for ask. Thank you anyways. I'm so sorry. I'll have to think about it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Rob, may I just follow up with a question, because you had mentioned you had mentioned sort of the political desire to go backwards on the part of leaders, and I was sort of thinking that with the transition movement, where it treats community sort of as the fundamental building block, I was sort of thinking whether you had any commentary on sort of like whether recent events kind of suggest that we need some emergency medical treatment for our communities, certainly in the United States, but perhaps in Bristol too.
You know, yeah, it's interesting that it feels like the stuff in Bristol is maybe a bigger news story in the US than it is here. Actually, it's kind of interesting. Everyone's talking about Bristol.
Well, Rajan's in the UK, so I'm actually I actually have no idea what's going on in Bristol.
Oh, okay. So Bristol is a city where I grew up, as somebody said earlier, which is a city which is probably one of the most progressive kind of arts, sort of liberal cities in the country. Very, very amazing. It's where Banksy comes from. A very, very strong kind of street art tradition. It was where kind of hip hop graffiti culture kind of really started in the UK. Amazing music scene, and it also has a long history of resistance and of sort of civil resistance in that way. Some very famous kind of historic riots back through the story of that city. I personally, I feel like actually what we're seeing in Bristol is a I mean, not all of it obviously, but actually the certainly the willingness to demonstrate and to oppose the appalling bill that the government are trying to bring in is a phenomenal thing. You know, if I was there and I wasn't such a coward, I'd be there with them, I'm sure. Yeah, I guess I just would love to see, and again, talking about Mariame Kaba's book, We Do This Till We Free Us, which is phenomenal, is that you really get a sense of the work that is being done in kind of Black abolitionist movements around what needs to shift in a culture. It's not as easy as just saying we just get rid of the police. You know, actually there's a whole process that needs to happen as we build in communities transformative justice and restorative justice and different funding models and different ways of resolving conflicts and different ways of completely reimagining the education system. All of that stuff has to kind of go with this. So I'm hoping that what we will see emerging, and it was really reassuring to see that Mariame's book was in the New York Times bestseller list a couple of weeks ago, is that alongside this movement that says we have to fight this push for really kind of a draconian policing, there needs to be all of us in our communities learning these tools around good communication and restorative justice, and this needs to be something that we you know, there was a question earlier about the Democratic Party and about politics. For me in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn was our last great chance to have transformative systems change led by government. And I've kind of pretty much given up on that idea now that that's going to happen. And I put all of my energy into saying, where does this come from in terms of communities, in terms of local governments, in terms of business? That's where this needs to come from. And that needs to come from us all learning different skills and developing a new kind of skill set at a community level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I was also thinking of kind of the situation where with like the Black Lives Matter protests and, you know, various things going on in the United States that sort of suggest that our communities don't interact within themselves anymore, but that a lot of that seems to take place on social media, where it gets disconnected and polarized at the same time.
Yeah, and it's it's really, really dangerous, and in Transition Network we recently did an event called the What Next Summit, and you can find all of the videos of the What Next Summit on YouTube. It was amazing. It was about kind of community-led movements for change using imagination. First week was what is, second week was what if, third week was what next. I really recommend a lot of the sessions in there. And one of the key things I came away with from that was how important it is to there was a speaker that we had who was from Black Lives Matter in Leeds. She was phenomenal, and she brought a really challenging provocation to this conference, which was mostly a white conference, not absolutely, and there was a massive effort made in terms of diversifying the speakers that we had and the movements who were represented there. But she talked about allyship. She used the word allyship. She said, you know, this is your transition movement needs to practice good allyship. And what does it mean to be a movement which is in good allyship with Black Lives Matter and movements of change that are emerging from communities of color? And I think that's such a fascinating question and such a fascinating challenge. And the bits of that conference that were most fascinating to me was just when we made opportunities for people to speak to each other with people they wouldn't have otherwise met, like kind of speed dating, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Need all of those conversations where we reach outside of our bubble and communicate with other people are some of the most precious and important things we can be doing. And actually one of the things that I think somehow it has a part to play in that is that exercise we did at the beginning with my time machine is that I've done that exercise with so many different groups of people. I've done that exercise with climate activists. I've done it with all different kinds of audiences who are absolutely not interested in that at all. And as I said, there's something about it where it takes you beyond your immediate sort of sense of identity, your immediate sort of things that we put in front of our vision. And it invites you to feel into, what would a future be like that's worth longing for? What would a future be like in which I felt nourished and happy and safe? Describe that future. And when you do that, it kind of becomes much, you start to realize that actually we're much, much more similar than we might like to think we are. And I've never done it where anyone has said, oh, it's great, I've got an 8G phone, it's fantastic, I can watch YouTube videos in HD. I've never had anyone say we've got this massive new IKEA on the edge of the town. Actually, you feed into a future where there's space and there's connection, we have time for each other and that kind of thing. And I've just put in a proposal to the BBC to do a radio program of going out to visit very different communities all around the country and doing that exercise with them, and then kind of putting all of their answers together to say that when you facilitate it properly, actually we're much less different than we might like to think we are. Mm-hmm. That we're living in a world where news publications and social media platforms profit enormously from driving this idea that we all hate each other and that we're all so different from each other. And it's a really toxic myth that has been fed by some really quite unpleasant people with a lot more money than you and I might have.
Agreed. Do I see any other questions? Because I know I have one more. Actually, it's a sort of a, you said I don't see any other questions, so I'm going to assume we're kind of wrapping up here. Unless, David, do you have a question or anything like that? Or
I could ask a question, kind of building off of one of the comments in the chat, which the person Suzette says, fatigue from the past year has exhausted my imagination, and I just wonder, like, to play the devil's advocate a little bit, how for folks that feel like they just are struggling to attend to what's happening next, you know, the day-to-day, just there isn't time to slow down, or the feeling of helplessness that they can't find the time to slow down and use their imagination. I mean, I definitely appreciate this conversation and the forward thinking and how this opens doors to the future. But I also sympathize with that kind of sense of helplessness or hopelessness. And I think this past year has really cemented some of those feelings for a lot of folks.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point. And you know, as I said before, there is a degree to which imagination is a function of privilege, and for me, it's why there's a whole bit in the book about where I say I think we need to recognize imagination as a universal right, and that at the moment we absolutely do not create the conditions for everybody to live an imaginative life, and we need, I think, to have like a national imagination act. What would it look like if the role of every public organization was to maximize the imagination of the people who interact with it? And I think absolutely we can look at the last year and say, in some ways, it has been exhausting on the imagination. In other ways, I think it's for quite a lot of people, it has been quite a phenomenal, particularly the beginning of it. Actually, I know during the lockdown, the first lockdown here in the UK, actually we saw this explosion of people writing the novel they'd always wanted to write, doing online art classes, doing videos of them all dressed up, their family all dressed up like old masters, paintings or doing sort of dance routines, and there's lots of that. I think as it's gone on, it has kind of started to wear people down, absolutely. But we did see a time when people had space, and I completely recognize that for many people that space isn't there, and which is why I feel like, as organizations, as employers, as local governments, as people, we need to be recognizing the need for space in our movements. Like, it was one of the things I love with the transition movement or Extinction Rebellion, is when they have meetings, they don't just meet as people with an agenda to get through. They meet as friends who care about each other, and they start with a check-in, so we know how everybody's doing. We do go rounds of appreciation. We design in space for different things, and we need to become better at designing that space into what we do. And we need, I think it's why I feel like it's the thing that motivated me to write the book, was that I kept reading people like Naomi Klein, Bill McKibben, who I really admire, who would say, they would drop this phrase in: climate change is a failure of the imagination. And I was thinking, and it kind of got under my skin, why are we having a failure of imagination? And I started to realize that as a population, we recognize that if a population doesn't have a good enough diet, we're going to see a rise in preventable illnesses. If we don't have a good enough education system, as a population, we're not going to reach our full potential. But just over here, kind of out of our eye shot, because we're too busy on the more important things, our collective imagination is just sort of dwindling and shrinking and contracting. And that really, really matters. And the point of the book was to put it back in the middle of the table and say, look at this. What happens to us collectively if our ability to be imaginative and to ask what if, and to see things as if they could be otherwise, is contracting at a time when we have to reimagine and rebuild everything? That really, really matters. And I'm not for a moment saying it's easy and everybody should, all rush around like Wordsworth writing poems about daffodils and somehow everything will become transformed. But if we don't look in our societies and our culture and our organizations at creating space for imagination, creating the conditions for imagination, creating narratives where we open up the possibility that maybe the future isn't just one of everything just getting slightly more and more shit every year, that actually there is the possibility that we could turn that around, then we're really finished. And so we have to put it back in the middle, and we have to give it the space and the attention that it deserves.
Can I give you a good outro question, the last question here, Rob? Sure. You've been doing this for some time. The Transition Handbook was 2008, and you were doing your research before that, et cetera, et cetera. If you had done your time machine experiment back then, thinking about now, how did that work? Do you feel like you've worked out to a good future so far? I'm sort of wondering how things are going, and like, how do you see your life now from the past future instead of the future past, the past future? Have you gotten somewhere that you imagined you would? Is Totnes or the life surrounding?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like to use a soccer analogy, as you would say, if this is a football match, it's half time and we're about 3-0 down. And we've played really well, and we've played some nice soccer, but we're losing 3-0. Because the forces that are pushing everything else in the opposite direction are so powerful, and so profoundly shameless. And when we started Transition in Totnes in 2005, we were trying to design something that might work in this town. We had that was it. That was the extent of our ambition. And if you had said, this thing you're starting in 12, 13 years time will be active in 50 countries around the world, in thousands of communities, I would have thought you were mad, but actually that's what's happened. And in a way which is self-organizing, in a way where we haven't rushed around the world opening head offices in different countries. It's just been self-organizing because there's a huge amount of trust and permission that goes along with transition. it is a movement that has taught me a huge amount about how change works in a way that's completely non-linear, that it's not like you do this and then this happens and then you do this and then that happens. It's actually more like you inoculate a culture with a mycorrhizal fungus, and it spreads, and sometimes it fruits in ways you expect and sometimes it fruits in ways you completely don't expect. And the thing that's been most delightful over that time has been the things that we didn't expect. The emails we get from someone wanting to start a transition group in the second biggest city in Iran, or in Ulaanbaatar, or people in Japan who started a community energy company and who, when the tsunami hit, took all of their solar panels on a truck down to the areas hit by the tsunami, or the people doing transition in the favelas in Sao Paulo, starting all kinds of social enterprises for women in favelas, or people starting community energy companies in really poor communities and finding that actually it became what people did with their money rather than put it in the bank was to invest in community owned energy. You know, I could tell stories about that like that all day long, and that has been the thing that is most extraordinary about it. Are we winning? No, we're losing. But I've seen enough football matches where the team was 3-0 down at half time and then they came out and won 5-3. And I know that what happened in the changing room at half time wasn't that the manager came in and said, hey, it's probably too late. I don't think we should bother. I think we're finished. You know, actually you keep going because you have no choice, because this is because the future could be different, and we don't need to believe that somehow it can only be like this. And I've seen so many stories around the world of ordinary people coming together with a good what if question and rolling up their sleeves. Somebody once called the transition movement hope with its sleeves rolled up, which I love. And I've seen enough examples of that as a really powerful, potent political force to know that actually, while it's not the only thing we need, it's a really key, vital piece of the jigsaw puzzle, that we start living today as if the changes that we want to see have already happened. And that really transforms the quality of our activism, I think.
All right. Thank you, Rob. That was a fantastic talk, and it was such a joy to have you here, and I appreciate it so much. I feel it's been a great, invigorating talk, and let's go. Ready.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Got my sleeves rolled up.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you. That was great.
All right. Very good. Have a great day, Rob. And thank you so much for presenting the School of Art, my class, the college. We all appreciate it. And I think, I think it's happening on a worldwide scale. So very good. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I see you're all still out there. Not all of you, but most of you. And we'll see you at another speaker series. And Rob, I look forward to the next installment of the podcast.
Do stand by. It's great.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.